Supply chains are complex, and securing your software supply chain is no exception. From the huge number of components and dependencies that you use from a wide variety of sources, to your developers adding their own code, to your applications being delivered to users around the world. How do you keep track of all this? At Anchore, we believe that managing and protecting your software supply chain starts with establishing trust. And that trust begins with understanding and managing your software bill of materials, or SBOM. SBOMs function as an ingredients label for software. And when you track and manage the ingredients, you can trust the components you use or bring into your development pipeline. It starts with verifying the provenance of open source code and validating supplier SBOMs, and keeping a repository of SBOMs to track the ingredients of your software over time. And maintaining trust as you build, with continuous automated security that uncovers vulnerabilities, malware, and leaked secrets, with compliance checks to root out any critical issues. Then, when you're ready to deliver your software, providing SBOMs and continuing to monitor for security risks after deployment, so your users can trust you and rest assured that the software you deliver was built securely every step of the way. To learn more about Anchore's software supply chain management solution, visit us at anchore.com.
Everyone, welcome to our joint webinar. Myself and Cornelia will be starting in just a moment, called Securing Kate's Supply Chain. My name's Alan Pope. I'm Director of Developer Relations at Anchore. And in a little bit, I'll talk about Anchore Enterprise, the software composition analysis tool for DevSecOps. But first, we've just got a couple of little housekeeping items, and then I'll hand over to Cornelia to talk about Spectro Cloud. So first of all, everyone's muted, so no matter how loud you shout, unfortunately we can't hear you. But if you would like to ask any questions, there is a section on the right-hand side where you can ask questions at any time. And when we find some time a little bit later, we'll pick out some interesting questions, and we'll try and endeavor to answer them. At the end of the session, you'll get a link with a follow-up email, and there'll be a recording of this session for you to watch. So don't worry if you miss anything, or if we speak too loud or you can't understand us, you can watch it again later. And there's also going to be some polls on the side of the screen, little questions, multi-choice questions. If you answer those, it gives us a bit of an idea of the audience, and maybe surprise us with the answers. We shall see. So let's dive in. As I said, I'm Alan, and with me is Cornelia. So I'll hand over to Cornelia, and I'll be back a little bit later.
Super. Thank you, Alan, so much. My name is Cornelia Davis. I am a technology fellow and the VP of product at Spectro Cloud. I've been in the application platform space for many, many years, spent some time at Pivotal as well, have been working with Kubernetes, and we're going to talk a little bit about Kubernetes in just a little bit. Have been working with Kubernetes for, 7 or 8 years or something like that. I'm delighted to be here with Anchore today. It's a super interesting topic because, as I mentioned, Kubernetes, and I'll describe Spectro Cloud in just a moment, is one of those runtime environments. I loved the video that we just kicked off with because it talked about securing your software supply chain all the way through, from development all the way to deploy. Well, deploy increasingly is happening on Kubernetes environments. And so this joint webinar and this better together solution between Spectro Cloud and Anchore is just such a natural fit. And so today, Alan and I are going to, take you through kind of how these things come together. And it really is, it's a very sweet story. We're going to do something a little unconventional here, and we're going to start from the end and work backwards. Software supply chain, if you think about it from a kind of sequence period. You write the code before you deploy it. But today we're going to start from it's running in production. And one of my favorite slides that I'm going to start with here is one, it's an oldie but goodie. This is a former colleague of mine from Pivotal, Andrew Clay Schaefer, who is one of the people who really founded the DevOps moniker and the DevOps kind of industry focus area. And the point here is that it is the focus is on the application. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the development environment, but even as I talk through, I'm sorry, not the development environment, the runtime environment, even as I talk through the details of that runtime environment, what we're going to stay focused on is why is that runtime environment there? It's there for the applications. So I love this. Originally, when he talked about this, it was even before the Kubernetes days. Andrew said, good job configuring servers this year, said no CEO ever. They care about the applications. And so the whole point here is that managing servers and now managing Kubernetes isn't the end state. It's really just the undifferentiated heavy lifting. And that's really what we focus on at Spectro Cloud. So let me go ahead and introduce you to Spectro Cloud by answering this question, which is how do we establish and manage that Kubernetes environment so that we can focus on the things that the CEO cares about, so that we can focus on the applications? And the short answer is that we need to basically industrialize that. We need to make sure that the Kubernetes management stuff just happens. It's easy to keep that in compliance and all of those things so that the applications, secure applications, can be deployed onto that environment. So let me tell you about how we do that. Spectro Cloud and our product palette is a Kubernetes management platform. It's designed to just make that Kubernetes infrastructure management, the deployment and management of it, easy. And the way that we do that is, I'm going to do a build out here of like 4 fundamental concepts. The first fundamental concept is that we provide you a platform in which you can model what your Kubernetes environments look like. In the same way that you as a developer might be modeling your applications. I've got a 3-tier application, I've got my database, I've got my services tier and my user interface tier. You model that as a deployment. Well, you want to model your infrastructure in the same way so that all of the management functions can execute against that model. Now, one of the things that we do at Spectro Cloud that is quite interesting is that we model those layers in the Kubernetes environment, both the foundational Kubernetes layers, as well as any add-ons, and I'll talk more about add-ons in just a moment, in such a way that it is declarative. It is so that all of the automation is going to operate the same way that Kubernetes operates your applications. You just declare what you want running, and the system takes care of it. With Spectro Cloud, you declare what you want running. Here's the Kubernetes environment that I want, and we make it so. So that's the first thing, is that we have you model those. And what you see here in this pretty little stack is the 4 bottom layers, which we consider the Kubernetes layers, the core infrastructure layers, operating system, Kubernetes, networking, and storage. And then there's a whole host of add-ons, and those add-ons can range from anything from observability to GitOps tooling to security. Yes, I'm kind of talking about something that we're going to get to later in the presentation. So you model this entire stack, and we call that a cluster profile. Then what we do is that we also, of course, then once you've modeled that, we manage the full life cycle. We do the deployments, we do the day 2 management, but you'll notice there in the icon that I even talk about day 0. Day 0 really begins with that modeling. It says, hey, I'm going to do a very careful job figuring out what I want my environments to look like so that my day 2 operations go more smoothly. So whatever you invest in day 0 makes day 2 and day 10 and day 1000 easier. So we focus on, and there's a little box that popped up on the left-hand side. When you're building these cluster profiles, at that profile building time, we do validation to make sure that you've created a model that is a consistent stack that is going to work not only on day one, but that will continue to work forward in day two. So you model your Kubernetes clusters. We have lifecycle management around that. But where are you going to deploy them? Well, we have a management platform that allows you to deploy and manage those clusters anywhere you want, from your own in-house data centers. So you can be doing this on VMware. You could be doing it on bare metal, those types of things. You could be managing these things in the cloud. You could be managing the Kubernetes clusters from infrastructure up, or you could be managing these as managed services like EKS, AKS, GKE. And then we also will help you manage those things on bare metal at the edge. So we have some very specific capabilities around being able to manage that at edge locations where, for example, and there's a poll that's on the screen right now, if you are in an edge environment and you're deploying Kubernetes on jet airplanes or you're deploying Kubernetes in your coffee shops, we have the ability to help you manage those things. And that's, I see one person has answered at least that they have, that they're deploying thousands of clusters. So maybe you're doing that in an edge scenario. And then the final thing I want to do to introduce our Kubernetes management platform before we start moving towards the SPOM topic that we're going to be talking about is that we have a very unique architecture that is a very distributed architecture. We call it centralized management distributed control. So that modeling capability and then the management, the ability to see across your 1,000 clusters or your 100 clusters, that's through a centralized management plane. But then the control is in fact distributed so that if, for example, your coffee shop has intermittent connectivity, you're still going to be running fine. And that's going to become very interesting because some of those security scanning things that Alan's going to talk about later, well, you want those to run even if you're disconnected from the mothership. And so we support that type of environment where we have centralized management and distributed control. So you can see that decentralized policy enforcement of centralized policy management. That's fundamental. Now, what I want to do is then, and here's another picture that shows you kind of that picture that I was just painting that says, well, we've got cluster profiles. Those cluster profiles describe the various types of Kubernetes clusters that I want. And that allows us then to have this model where we can request a cluster, we can provision that cluster. And what you see on the right-hand side of the screen is that you can see that there are two instances, two different clusters that are following the cluster profile that's on the far left. They're at the bottom of the slide. Then the cluster profile, so the modeled Kubernetes cluster that's in the middle, well, there's 3 clusters out there. And you notice that some of those might be on AWS or Azure or GCP, those types of things. So what we have here then is a Kubernetes estate that we help you manage. We, of course, do governance, access, visibility, cost control, but really the area that we're going to focus today is around that security and governance. So then showing you a little bit more of what that looks like, the product that I'm talking about here is Palette. So Spectro Cloud Palette is this management platform. The management what you're seeing here is you're seeing a single cluster. So we also have a multi-cluster view. I'm not showing that to you here because I really want to get into the details of a single cluster. So what you can see here on this cluster screen is you can see how much CPU and memory is being used. It's starting to show you some of the breakdown of what you have running on the cluster in terms of namespaces. It's giving you URLs to access things like a Kubernetes dashboard. If I click further into this, and I click on one of these other tabs, the workloads tab, for example, you can now get a view of the workloads that are running in this cluster. Now, where it starts to get really interesting for this particular webinar is if I click on this scan button, you will get to this screen. And we support a number of different kinds of scans. The three that you see at the top are really about the Kubernetes infrastructure itself. There is, for example, the third one down, you can see there's Kubernetes conformance testing. So some of you who are more well-versed in the Kubernetes space might be asking, is that Sonobuoy? It absolutely is Sonobuoy. So that's a way that we can test and we can verify that the Kubernetes clusters that have been created by Spectro Cloud Palette from these cluster profiles, these that you've modeled yourself, are actually conformant clusters, which means that you can ensure that the workloads that are running on a conformant cluster can run on a different conformant cluster. We also have other scans around that Kubernetes environment, configuration security and penetration testing. Those are really very specific to your Kubernetes configuration and the way that the Kubernetes clusters are showing up. Now, the last one that you see on the screen here, the software bill of materials, of course, is exactly in the title of today's webinar. What we support today out of the box is we do support the ability for you to come into a cluster. You can click the configure scan button. So you as an administrator are coming in and saying, oh, I want to do an SBOM scan right now at this point in time. So you can go into the UI, come down to the cluster, click configure scan. You can choose the scan format, and Alan's going to be able to tell you a whole lot more about these types of things than I will. You can say whether you want to do that scan on workloads that are running across the entire cluster, which means some of the Kubernetes components themselves, whether you want to go within a particular namespace. So for example, just one application. You can use a label selector to decide which things you want to do the SBOM scan of, etc. You can even go down to the level of a single pod and do SBOM scanning there. Once you've made those selections and you've clicked confirm, I'll draw your attention to the upper right-hand corner where it says scan is scheduled. So the scan is scheduled and you can come back at a later time and we'll show you the results of that scan. So we do support, we recognize the need here, but it's a very simple implementation. And so with this, I'm going to hand the mic back over to Alan because he's going to pick it up here and say, great, that's super, but he's going to show you how Anchore actually industrializes that whole SBOM scanning. I wouldn't call this an industrialization, what we have. It's a very useful tool, but if you want to take it to the next level, that's where Anchore comes in. Alan, you want to take it from here?
Thanks so much. That's a great introduction. I had a play around with Palette myself, and it's surprisingly easy because from my perspective, I'm more of an open source background, and Kubernetes is quite new to me, and so your wealth of experience with Kubernetes is interesting and valuable to have. But I'm quite the newbie as far as Kubernetes. My focus is elsewhere. So this I found very approachable and easy to use. So well done. So yeah, that was great. But let's have a look at some of the challenges with software delivery. And there are some risks with software delivery, and that's what we're trying to identify and reduce some of those risks. The supply chain is complex. Code can enter like almost anywhere in this supply chain, and security risks can enter in many of those places. And some of those security risks are the traditional known vulnerabilities that come with new dependencies and that kind of thing. But often it's more than just vulnerabilities. It could also be malware. Crypto miners are common these days, but there's also leaked secrets like AWS keys, SSH keys, that kind of stuff. And even just misconfiguration, stuff that's not configured correctly. And you need to take account of all of that beyond just CVEs, for example. And we also see malicious actors typo squatting on dependencies. So one day you think you're pulling in a good piece of code from a known name, and another day that changes ownership somehow, and maybe a developer has changed the name of the product, or maybe one of your developers has put the wrong character in the name of a code. And so typo squatting and people taking over other people's repositories, these kind of things are things we need to be able to scan for, identify, and be aware of. And the earlier on we can do it in this software supply chain, the better.
So, Alan,
There's
I
also,
can't help but
yeah,
interjecting with a question.
yeah,
I've
yeah,
not
go for
heard
it.
of this typo squatting before. So
Yeah,
basically, people go out there and they put, let's say, artifacts up in a registry somewhere that have typos in them, so that if and they might like predict, like, oh, people often leave off the S over here, so I'm going to put something with a vulnerability without that
yeah.
S up over in that.
It's
Is that what you're
it's
telling?
Yeah, it's very much like with DNS. People register domains that are named very similar to popular brands. It's that kind of thing. If you've got a node
Wow.
module or a Python package or something that is popular, then maybe if someone registers something that's very closely named, then maybe they'll catch someone, and they don't really have to catch too many people to make that profitable.
Wow.
And yeah. So yeah, these problems can enter pretty much anywhere in that pipeline, from source code through to deployment and running. And you need to scan at every stage. You can't just wait until the final container is built and you're shipping it. You've got to really start early. And if you don't start scanning early, then you'll find problems later that will take longer to fix and cause delays in releasing. So we advocate scan early, scan often. And new risks can enter at any stage as well. So your tool chain could be bypassed or compromised at any point within the workflow from source to deployment. And so each time that can happen, you risk new vulnerabilities being introduced, or dependency hijacking, like I said, or typo squatting. And you need to be able to have visibility of all of this with a tool of some kind. And as good as the SBOM generation is within Spectro Cloud, you kind of need something like you said, a bit more industrial, something that's doing this on a regular basis across potentially thousands of SBOMs. We have customers who are generating thousands of SBOMs a day, and you need to be able to stay on top of that. And so that's the core message: is there's some danger out there, and you can protect yourself from it. So how do we help? Well, we have a product, Anchore Enterprise, and it's built upon a couple of open source tools called Sift and Gripe that we sponsor the development of. And there's a whole bunch of other open source components within here, but those are the two probably most famous of the open source tools. And these tools can be used to generate those SBOMs and search for vulnerabilities within those SBOMs. But beyond that, Anchore Enterprise can also do the searching for secrets, and malware, and files that shouldn't be there, and lots more on top of the basic functionality that you get with the open source tools, Sift and Gripe. What they do is pull in data from known vulnerability feeds. So the logos that you see at the top of the diagram above inspection, Red Hat, Canonical, NVD, GitHub, and a bunch of other feeds are supported by the tools that pull in all this data and collapse that data together so that we can have an accurate representation of what the vulnerability profile looks like in your code base. Ideally, it's none, but when I do a little demo later, you'll see it almost certainly won't be zero, but you have to be able to be informed to be able to make a decision about whether a vulnerability is something you really need to be concerned about, or whether you can dismiss it and know that that's not going to adversely affect your deployment. So we trigger on a number of different factors. I've talked about a few of them, and I'll demo them a little bit later. I think there's a slide just coming up that talks about this, but the key part of this is the SBOM generation. And the thing about our SBOM generation is it's not just looking for CVEs. Vulnerabilities are certainly something we should care about, but on top of that, we also need to audit licenses. Maybe you have compliance requirements which dictate which licenses you're allowed to use, which open source licenses you're allowed to use. Maybe you're not supposed to use a particular license under company policy, or maybe it's part of the industry that you're in, that there are policies that dictate which licenses you should or shouldn't use. And Anchore can detect that as well, not just the vulnerabilities, but also the licenses that each of the software packages that are listed in are distributed under. And you can set gates on those particular licenses and trigger alerts and all those kind of good things. You configure those policies in Anchore Enterprise as policy packs. It comes shipped with some policy packs, but we can maintain our own policy packs, and you can update the policy packs with your own bespoke rules. So it's the policy packs that define mapping your company policy and your industry's required policies to Anchore Enterprise. And you can have multiple policies for different projects, multiple policies for different types of container images, and different types of software distribution. So it's very flexible and beyond just show me all the CVEs. The other thing that's interesting about Anchore Enterprise is we have 100% API coverage for this. What does that mean? Well, it means you can drive Enterprise with other automation tools. So you could use curl to drive Anchore by sending in submitting your images for scanning and retrieve the details all via an API that's all fully documented on our website. It's all under docs.anchore.com. You can then retrieve details about the images that you've submitted, whether they have malware, what OS is in there, what packages are in there. You can find out what the vulnerabilities are, the CVEs, the exposed ports, for example, maybe even inappropriate Docker settings that are in the Docker file. You could find those and retrieve those via the API. It's all presented via a web UI as well. We do provide a nice user interface. We also provide a command line interface called Anchore CTL. And that's super useful if you want to integrate with CI and CD systems. And we're agnostic about CI and CD. We support GitHub, GitLab, Jenkins, but with this Anchore CTL command line tool, which is just a single binary, you could integrate with whatever CI CD system you use and submit your images to Anchore's enterprise product. And from there, it can do the scanning and reporting and alerting based on your own profiles, your own policies, NIST, CIS, HIPAA, whatever it might be, FedRAMP. So how does it work? Well, the marketing architecture diagram that is like almost true looks a little bit like this. The SBOMs come in at the bottom. The main crux of this is the SBOM management part is the core part of Anchore Enterprise. And it's the enterprise block at the bottom that's doing the scanning for vulnerabilities, the looking for malware, identifying secrets like SSH keys or passwords in etc password or whatever it might be, and also implements where the policy is defined, whatever that may be, and the reporting, auditing, and sending emails and triggering messages on Slack or however you want to be alerted to these problems. And at the top, what we're highlighting is that software pipeline that I mentioned earlier, where we go from source through build, and there you can see mentioned Anchore CTL. We can integrate with your GitHub, GitLab, wherever you keep your source code and your CI system, and pull in those SBOMs early on in the process. As I was talking about earlier, the earlier you get these SBOMs generated, the easier it is to identify these things early in that timeline. And then in the middle, we can integrate with your registry, wherever you put your containers, whether that's like Docker Hub or GitHub Container Registry, whichever registry that might be, we can pull the images from that registry. So that's the next step in that timeline. And then when you come to deploy, we can use another tool, which I think we'll come to a little bit later, called Emission Controller. But also we can do a live inventory of your Kubernetes cluster as well, directly while it's live. So all the way through, from developers writing code in a text editor, all the way through to a container running somewhere on somebody else's computer. That's roughly how it works at a high level.
So I'd love to use this diagram to highlight a couple of things, because I think what we're starting to move toward here now is I showed you all Palette, you're talking about Anchore, and I think that this is an ideal diagram for us to look for kind of those synergies. One of the things that's interesting, if we look across well, I want to start actually at the bottom. So you talk about SBOM management. So I made the point when I was showing the SBOM scanning that we do, that sometime later you can come back and there will be the report. But there's a couple of key words on this. When you get up a couple of layers, it's reporting and auditing. So this notion of being able to keep track of all the SBOM scans that you've done across this entire life cycle to ensure that oh, when did you first see something? When was it remediated and all of that stuff? That's a huge value that Anchore can bring over and above just the SBOM scanning, is that the whole management of the reports, visibility, all of that stuff. I'm right there?
Yes, thank you so much. Yes, I think that's one thing that differentiates it from, you could just go and get SIFT, the open source tool, but there's so much you're missing, like that whole historical record, because no project starts and ends in a day. This is going to take a long time. And as you said, if you've got that historical record from the beginning of the project of every SBOM, of every container and every source commit, then you can say, I know exactly where that came from. I know what it was before, whether it was a change in a dependency or somewhere further down the chain, you can pinpoint exactly where it came from. And when I'll give you a very brief demo of the UI, you'll be able to see it bubbles that information up to you very easily. It's not like you have to go digging around in JSON, but you can do that if you want to as well. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and because you on the far right-hand side under run can do those scans directly on what's running on Kubernetes, which I showed you the lightweight version of, but you have the ability, that's what allows you to integrate those SBOM scans all the way down into that management plane for visibility, auditing, and so on, even from the runtime side. So that's a sweet spot.
So in my limited experience of Kubernetes, I don't think I'm breaking any taboos here by saying it's quite complicated and it's quite tricky to set up. And I know people who have many years experience will say, no, Alan, it's simple and it's straightforward. But it is if Kubernetes is not your focus, it's hard, right? And so you need people who can make it easier to deploy your application on Kubernetes. And then you need someone who can take the worry away that what you're deploying is safe, right? And it's not going to cause you any risks later on. So yeah, it does seem like the kind of symbiotic relationship.
Yeah. And so that takes me to actually my second point, which is right in the middle there. You talk about stage and registry. So I do want to highlight, I already alluded to the fact that your Kubernetes cluster has the core layers plus a bunch of other things. And I mentioned things like observability and add-ons. Well, registry is one of those things that you could say, well, actually, the registry is something that I want to manage in this, declarative, modeled way. And so we have, for example, you'll see later, we have the ability for you to use our modeling capabilities to deploy a Harbor registry, for example.
Perfect.
And so now we can help with the infrastructure, and then you're layering these SBOM capabilities on top of that. And registry is really kind of part of your overall software infrastructure.
Right. And that's the thing, for a very simple deployment, you might be leveraging GitHub, you might be leveraging Docker Hub, you might be leveraging all these other tools to save you money and hassle. But in many regulated environments, you need to be in control of all of this. And so, yeah, you would want to deploy your own registry and point Anchore at that registry and get your images that you've built with your fair hands, with all the software that you've accumulated through that source and build cycle. And absolutely, that Anchore can do that.
Yep. And then the final thing, which is probably the one that I think is the coolest, is that admission controller. And so I'll remind folks who've been listening that I talked about you model day 0 through day 2 life cycle against whatever infrastructure. And then the final call out was this distributed architecture. And I emphasized the point that we had centralized management of policies and distributed control. And so that admission controller, which is something that Anchore offers, is in alignment with that same theme, which is now Anchore is the centralized management of the policy, which is realized through this admission controller, which says, hey, if you're not meeting these things, it isn't even going to get deployed on the Kubernetes cluster.
Exactly.
And we're going to talk in a little bit about how you can get these Anchore components into your cluster. We'll show you how y'all can do that after you do your demo. But that's a super important thing. There's synergy, again, with the architecture that you have, which is, again, some level of centralized management, or quite a bit of centralized management, but some of the enforcement is out at the cluster level itself. So there's admission controllers.
Yeah, absolutely. Groovy. Thanks for clarifying all of that for me. I appreciate that.
No, it's good.
No, it's great.
It's better together story here. So
exactly. Yep. I mentioned policy bundles, and this is just an overview of what those policy bundles contain. The policy bundles are the rules that you set within Anchore, where you can define exactly as you just said, actually, that step where the admission controller is deciding maybe on a strict basis that you've set rules that say absolutely this image cannot be deployed, or maybe you just want it to notify you when there's things that you should care about, but allow it to be deployed anyway. It depends how strict you want to set your policy. And so that's where this policy bundle comes in, is where you can define things like the allow list of images that you allow through. And there may be images that you absolutely cannot let through because of some, mandated policy that is outside of your control, that you're not allowed to distribute that or run that. And so you have quite a lot of control over what the rules are in this deployment. So I wanted to just give you a quick demo. Hopefully, if the demo gods are shining down on me today. So in theory, if I share a screen, and in theory, if I show this screen here, nothing. Oh, there we go. Take a moment. Right. So this is just a very small install of Enterprise. Hopefully you can see that okay. I'm already logged in. It's my own personal instance. It's not connected to an enormous Kubernetes cluster full of lots of software. I've just thrown a few images at it, just so you can get a feel for what this looks like and what you're likely to get. And you can see here, there's a few images in here. What I'll do is I'll pick one that's the most interesting, which is the most scary one, which is this one here, which I've said I want to receive alerts when events are triggered or policy failures are triggered on this one. And actually, when you log in, you wouldn't end up here. You'd end up straight at this dashboard, and you'd immediately see there's an alert. There's a number of stops here for that particular repository with this tag from this registry. So you immediately can see there is a problem here, and you can dive in and investigate. There's more information further down, the pretty graphs, the big numbers, how bad things really are. But if we just dive into this image, I just want to show you what you see. Now, remember, this is all coming from SBOMs generated from a Docker image, right? So what's really here is an inventory of all the stuff that's inside that Docker image, which is operating system packages, which are RPMs, because this is a Red Hat based image. There are node packages in there. This has got everything in it. It's got, I don't know, Python stuff in there, and there's probably all sorts of other bits and bobs in here as well. But you can scroll through this list and see what's in there. But I'm showing you this to show you can dive in and see what's inside the image. You can see metadata about when it was built, the architecture it was built for, and the operating system it contains. But let's go to this policy compliance screen, which is where we get taken to when there's policy violations. We can see here there's a lot. This is unusual because this is an orchestrated demo that has lots of problems. If I can filter this out and only focus on the really important stuff. I mentioned that there's a policy. We're using this default policy over here, which has found a bunch of issues. There's a critical issue here, a vulnerability found in a non-operating system package, and it's an NPM package. So there's something in here from Node, and it doesn't take long to see that it's a Node module called XML DOM, and there is a known vulnerability. And if we can just click through and open in another tab and read about this, and make a decision, make an informed decision about what we do about this particular problem. And there are others that, the severity here comes from the upstream providers who have given us this data that we're cross-referencing with the SBOM. And the stop gate is coming from the policy, which says, something that's high, that's not an operating system package, should stop the flow. We can dive into the report, and it generates a report specifically for that CVE that it's identified. And if we preview the results, we can see all the images that are affected by this particular CVE. And included in that is the image that I've got here that's based on RHEL. So it's pretty straightforward to see, navigate around, find the issues that you have to deal with. What do you do with them? Well, this one here, I could hit the little drop down here, and it's pretty straightforward. There's a vulnerability in this particular package. What does Anchore recommend you do? Well, you should probably update that package. That's a good recommendation. And what we could do is create an action here. We could type something ourselves, or we could just tick the box and then hit the button, and that adds it to our action workbench of things we now have to work through. We've gone through some of those items and identified things that need fixing. And how do we fix them? Well, we probably need to update this, and this will stay here until we remove it, until we fix this issue. And we would need to do the same for the other issues. But again, this is a ludicrous example because this is an orchestrated demo with many failures that you're unlikely to see. If I took a more straightforward example like Ubuntu, for example, you look in here and it's nice and clean. Look at this. It's much better. There are 3 warnings, but none of these are enough with our policy to stop this getting through. So you are in control of what the gating process is here. And the policy is defined in here. There's policies up here. We've got our default policy. You can create your own. You can modify this existing one. And down here, if I edit this container image settings, you can see here it says, if we've got exposed ports like port 22, that's a stop error. If we've got packages with more than a medium severity, or sorry, if it's got a medium severity equal to medium, then that's a warning. If the packages have issues that are greater than medium, then it's a stop error. And you can tweak these, add your own, select your own gates in your own policy. It's all very configurable. So I just wanted to show you a quick demo of a wild scenario and a slightly less wild, more reasonable image. But that's just me scanning one container. You imagine scaling that up to many containers, tens, hundreds of containers, all containing different kinds of software. I hope that made sense.
Made a lot of sense to me. Thank you.
Cool. No worries. Let's get the slides back. I think that's the end of my little demo.
Okay, so I had promised earlier to talk to you about, okay, so you've seen all this great Anchore stuff. You've seen how we manage Kubernetes using Spectro Cloud Palette. How do we then get Anchore onto those Kubernetes environments? Well, it turns out that that's another one of the values that we bring from a managed Kubernetes service, is that we do help you bring things onto your Kubernetes clusters. Going back to this picture, which I shared with you in the beginning, it's all about modeling what you want on your clusters. You have the core Kubernetes cluster in layers again, the 4 at the bottom. And again, I mentioned things like observability and GitOps and networking, Istio, those types of things. Anchore is one of the things that you want to put on your clusters. It's one of the things that you want to ensure that the admission controllers are there so that you can do the enforcement for the policies that you're using Anchore to set up. And it also can help you potentially assist you in deploying Anchore itself. So how do we then package Anchore up in such a way? And this is something that our companies together are working on. Let me show you conceptually how that works. So what I'm doing here is showing you a few screenshots from our palette product where you can use the modeling to model these layers. What I'm doing here is I am modeling in what we call an add-on layer. So it's not the core Kubernetes layers, it's the layers above. You can see right now that there's no layers modeled. When I click then on add a new pack, a pack is something that bundles up a certain set of content, a certain set of applications, so that those things would then later on, when you instantiate a cluster or you add this add-on layer to a cluster, that those things are going to get deployed. So when I click on add new pack, I get a library of different things that are available for me to add to my Kubernetes clusters. So you can see that there are authentication services, ingress services, other networking services like Istio that I mentioned. I talked earlier about Harbor, but there's some others as well here. So there's ways of setting up credentials for your registry and so on. These are all things that you're going to add and inject into your clusters. And of course, there's a big bucket of security here. Security. There was a poll question earlier that said, what are the big things that are keeping you from doing Kubernetes? And there were multiple of you that answered security concerns. So some of the security concerns here that Alan's been talking about, but there might be some others as well. So for example, OPA, Open Policy Agent, is something that's available there. What we are working on within our partnership is adding Anchore as an option in this list of security capabilities that you can add into your Kubernetes environment. So that's exactly how you would do it. Now, of course, you can install Kubernetes on you can install Anchore in any environment. It doesn't only work in a Palette managed Kubernetes cluster, but what Palette does is it allows you to not only manage your Kubernetes, but all of the other things that you need around your Kubernetes environment, including things like SBOM scans.
I think this is quite appealing, because it's the, point and click. It's like an app store, like a model of adding additional features to your stack. And I love the idea of us having an Anchor icon in there as a community contributed pack, or we work together on some kind of pack that we can press a button and instant deploy the necessary parts. Because like I said, we know Kubernetes is hard, and deploying substantial applications is hard. And so anything we could do to make it easier to get people on that on-ramp is going to be a great thing.
Yeah, that was another earlier poll question, and there were multiple people who said that another thing that was keeping them from doing Kubernetes was lacking the necessary skills to do so.
Right. I'm not surprised. But there are tools like yours that have filled that gap, and it really is a gap. There was a question that came up in the chat that I just wanted to address. There's a question like, how do you handle secret scanning? And the policy has an option where you can add a gate, and it's based on regular expressions. So, if your secret is AWS underscore, something, you can search for that. If you know the actual secret name, then, you could search for the environment variable or whatever it is, but it's based on, regex, basically.
Yeah. There's another question that I'll field from the audience. Somebody asked for advice on Kubernetes design and deployment. And the best way that I can answer that is I can point you to a GitHub repository by none other than Kelsey Hightower, who is quite well known in the Kubernetes space. The GitHub repository, if you Google it, Google Kubernetes the hard way. And I looked it up while you were chatting, Alan. The first commit in that repository was July 7th of 2016, so just over 8 years ago. And what I think is so clever, and we all know that Kelsey Hightower is very clever, is that his commit message on the very first commit was, quote, "Let the pain begin." And for the first number of years before there were tools like Palette, it was the hard way, and everybody was figuring out how to stand up and manage their Kubernetes clusters the hard way. And in fact, Kelsey turned that into a book and all of those types of things. And by the way, I worked on another Kubernetes management platform previously when I was at Pivotal, and we took a lot of inspiration from the learnings that Kelsey Hightower put out there. So the TLDR answer to that question is, don't do it yourself. Leverage tools like Spectro Cloud Palette to help you, because it is extraordinarily complex. And I'll take you all the way back to the very first slide that I shared, which was, it's not about the infrastructure. Where your corporation gets value is when you are delivering workloads and applications on that infrastructure. So don't put your bright people on figuring out how to do Kubernetes the hard way. Find tooling to help you do Kubernetes so that you can have your bright talent working on delivering value to your business.
Yeah, I understand, like the Palette community packs mostly leverage other tools like Helm. Is that right?
Yeah,
Helm charts?
That's right. That's right, exactly. And so we're embracing industry standards, and there's an awful lot of the CNCF is probably, I don't know, maybe it's arguably even more successful than Linux, than the Linux, foundation, even though it's under the Linux Foundation. It's an extraordinarily successful open source governance community that has literally more than 1,000 different, bucket things that contribute to that. And so we adhere to those standards, and even like I mentioned Sonobuoy earlier, that's a kind of standardized, it's a de facto standard for doing conformance testing of your clusters. So yeah.
I wish I'd known about this Kubernetes the hard way before. Not that I'm, a glutton for punishment, but it's like running Arch Linux or something. You've got to learn sometime to do it, try something a bit more difficult and get out of your comfort zone. So I appreciate you sharing that, because I've not seen that before.
Yeah.
Do we have any other questions or comments or surprising poll results?
Let's look back at the polls. So I'd love for you to maybe comment on what happened? The polls disappear. Oh no, I clicked on something. There's one around the biggest security risks. I'd love for you to comment on those.
Oh, wow. So known vulnerabilities, with the 4 options of known vulnerabilities, malware dependencies, insider attacks. I'm surprised. I mean, low sample group here, so I'm not going to draw any conclusions from this. I do find it fascinating that when you look at the research, that while all of those things that you should be very wary of, that hit the news of vulnerabilities and typo squatting and hijacking repositories, they're surprisingly few and far between. And what's way more common is insider attacks and not having the right policies for internal access to repositories, code bases, systems, and so on. So I'm kind of pleasantly surprised that there's an even split between these, because from what I understand, insider attacks are just as likely as any other. And so you need something that can give you the broad spread of scanning all of those areas and not just focus on like CVEs, for example.
Yeah. Cool. Let's take a quick peek back at the questions. Okay. So I advanced us to the next step slide.
Thank you.
There's a whole bunch of links here for you all to be able to get more information. I'll just take a moment to call out the bucket there that's next to Spectro Cloud. Spectro Cloud, we've talked about some of those security needs, and we have, of course, a security link where you can take a look. As we saw, security is definitely one of the concerns in your Kubernetes environment, and so you can get more information on that. The other thing that I want to talk about is that I mentioned that we support in-house data centers, cloud, as well as edge. So one of the other areas that we are really advancing, we're really kind of tip of the spear on the security side in the Kubernetes space, is around what we call the Secure Edge Native Architecture. That's what that acronym is, that SENA. This is work that we did together with Intel that has a roadmap, and it has a reference architecture, if you will. And we have partial support for that reference architecture directly in our stack that allows you to apply specific things that are unique to the edge scenarios. So for example, in an edge scenario, we have customers who are deploying Kubernetes on devices that are going out in theater. And by out in theater, I mean out in battlefields, in those types of scenarios. Well, what we need to do is there is by definition no perimeter around that Kubernetes cluster. So there's no perimeter around the applications and the data that's also on that cluster. So what we do with the Secure Edge Native Architecture is we address those security concerns that are unique to edge. And like I said, we are implementing that. It's all on our roadmap to implement into the product. So security is definitely top of mind here at Spectro Cloud as well. And we invite you to really reach out to any of us. But these are some security specific links. But if you're interested in Kubernetes as a management platform, please do also reach out to us as well. And Alan, you've got a bunch of links here as well.
Yeah, yes, we filled it up. So we've got some case studies that people could look at if they want some further reading. But what may also be interesting is to actually try Anchore. And we have a free trial. So you can deploy it in Kubernetes, or you can use just plain old Docker on a laptop or on a larger deployment elsewhere. And you get a free trial. You can have a play with it, throw images at your Anchore and play around with the policy rules and do what I did. Like this, the image here that I've been using, it's just running on the laptop behind me. So it's pretty straightforward to set up. I'm on a learning curve with Kubernetes and Docker. So if I can do it, anyone can do it.
Awesome. All right, I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat. So I'll say on behalf of Spectro Cloud, thank you so much for joining the webinar, or if you're watching this later on, thanks for listening. We would love to chat with you about your Kubernetes needs, your security needs, and as well as if you do, please let all of us know if you're interested in a joint solution. And Alan, I'll let you close us up.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been lovely to have this opportunity to talk about two different sets of technologies that work together as symbiotically as this. So yes, if you would like to find out more, you can get in touch with us. You have our contact details, and we send out a newsletter on a regular basis. It's lightweight, only once a month. And you can get some more information about what's developing. We put out new versions of Anchore every month, and take a look at our GitHub repository. If you look at the link, github.com/Anchore, you'll find all our open source tools as well, like Sift and Gripe, which are part of the underpinnings of all of this. So yes, thank you so much for joining us. And maybe we'll see you on the next one.
Super. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks.